This is Amy, and you're listening to the Talkin' Appalachian podcast, the first episode of Season 2. Happy July, and thanks for listening to this first episode of Season 2. I started this podcast back in July of last year, so this is a milestone. I couldn't be more excited to launch another year of content about language and lore and literature and places and spaces, and I plan to add a lot of content for those of you who are teaching Appalachian studies who'd like to include dialects and folk etymology and folklore in your classes. I love hearing from y'all, so I hope you'll join in one of the communities on social, YouTube, or Patreon for bonus content and discussion. I want to welcome all of you who have subscribed on Patreon. Just thank you for your support. Joining there as a paid subscriber means you get more of that, plus you're helping me in the work of the podcast. And so I'm always grateful for that support. We were in a beautiful southern Appalachian city this weekend, Knoxville, Tennessee. Shout out to Knoxville. And I want to thank my Knoxville listeners for reaching out when you saw my posts. Yes, I love your city, and I had such a good time enjoying it. We took Willow, our golden retriever, with us, and while my husband was golfing over in Sevierville, I stayed in the downtown area. Now, I live just a little over a couple of hours away, so I've been coming to Knoxville my whole life. Camps, concerts, Vols games, but I never really explored downtown like we have in recent months. When I was little, my parents brought my brother and me to the 1982 World's Fair, which I still remember was this huge deal. I can remember the theme song for it in the commercials. The day we came down, President Jimmy Carter was there with his family. So I have this memory of President Carter being in the China Pavilion. And so it was closed because of security and we couldn't go in. And that was the one place I think my mom and dad really wanted to see. I remember the brilliance of that sun sphere and how it's been sort of the iconic symbol of Knoxville since then, since it was built. The former grounds of the World's Fair is now World's Fair Park. And so Willow and I spent a lot of time walking down there early in the morning before the heat set in. We walked down the riverfront. Brian and I had dinner on the riverfront one night. It's so beautiful, and you can't take a bad picture. All the bridges and the river. It's just a gorgeous place. And then, of course, Market Square and Gay Street. So much to do there. One of our favorite things we like to do on Saturday morning is go to Market Square to the farmers market. And we can't forget that the Tennessee Vol baseball team just won the College World Series, which is, of course, a big deal here. It was exciting to follow. And if you grow up around here, you're either a Vols fan or a Kentucky Wildcat. So in my particular family, it's Big Orange. So congratulations to the Vols and their success. So my husband and I love history. So when we travel, we like to stay in old places. And if you followed my stories on Instagram or Facebook, you saw photos of where we stayed in Knoxville. I'll put some of those up on our YouTube channel too, in our Appalachian Spaces and Places. We stayed in a 1929 apartment building, and I hope I pronounced this correctly. It's called the Richelin Building. It's on Hill Street overlooking the river, so I was able to walk everywhere I wanted to go from there. But across the street, there's a boarded up antebellum or neoclassical style mansion behind an iron fence called the Lord Lindsay. And you can tell it was something to see in its prime. So, of course, I had to look up the history. And I'm sure Knoxville folks will know this already, but I'm going to share with you what I found, Knox, Tennessee website, and also the Knox Heritage Walking Tour brochure. So this home was built in 1903 as a wedding gift from A. Percy Lockett for his wife. And it was their home until they moved in the late 1920s. In 1929, the space was later converted to a house of worship and operated as the first Church of Christ Scientist. And I'm not sure what that means. By 1977, it had been converted to a bar, restaurant, and event space. But from what I'm reading, it was the premier place to be in Knoxville in the 70s, Thursday through Saturday nights. And it stayed open as an event space until the late 90s. So it was a home, a church, a restaurant, and a bar with a disco. So can you imagine the stories that the walls could tell? So the Lord Lindsay has sat idle for the better part of 2 decades and holds a place on Knox Heritage's fading fast list. So I hope someone decides to restore it. Historical buildings and homes will be something I'll talk about from time to time in this Appalachian Places and Spaces segment of the podcast. If you have a place or space you recommend I visit, please let me know. Contact me in one of the links in the show notes. I would love to have seen more in the short time I was there, but the onset of dog days is here and the heat just kept driving us off the street, which is what I'm going to talk about next. Dog Days begins July 3rd, just after the summer solstice, and it marks the hottest time of year in the Northern Hemisphere. And in parts of Appalachia where weather watching is particularly important because of crops and gardens, the phrase dog days is something you hear pretty frequently around this time of year because there's so much lore associated with it. I did a little bit of research on the actual origin of the phrase, and what I found was that it dates back to 1500s England, which was really surprised me, with the following phrase about the time period. Dogs go mad and snakes go blind, eggs become addled or hatch crazy chickens when the earth should not be tilled and vegetables are not to be harvested or trees felled. And it also says it is a time when all liquids are poisonous, when bathing, swimming, or even drinking water can be dangerous, and a time when no sore or wound will heal properly. And then in 1817, the Farmer's Almanac said this. Dog days are approaching. You must therefore make both hay and haste while the sun shines, for when old Sirius takes command of the weather, and that's the constellation in the shape of a dog. He is such an unsteady, crazy dog, there is no dependence on him. So it's my understanding that you hope for dry weather during dog days, even though that long period of drought can be scary and problematic because the patterns over time have shown a favorable outcome later. But someone who can tell us a lot more about that is Shallon Payne, creator of the wildly popular Instagram account and website, The Appalachian Homestead. Shallon is a fellow Central Appalachian from just up the road, and her family's dedication to cultivating, foraging, and preserving their own food goes back for generations. She has learned what we in Appalachia would call the old ways, and what that means is if there happens to be an apocalypse, her family will know how to survive off the grid. She's got recipe books and pressure canning guides, foraging advice, everything from poison ivy treatment to fermentation advice on her blog and in the Cooking on the Compound Club. And I'll share the link to her website in the show notes if you want to take a look. You've seen me share some of her stories on Instagram, especially about folklore, and she's well versed in dog days. So I thought I would call her up and ask her what she knows about it. Shallon, welcome to the Talking Appalachian podcast.
Thank you. I think you might have built me up a little more than what I actually am.
Not at all. So, can you start by telling listeners a little about you and your family and the Appalachian Homestead?
So, my family has always grown and preserved their own food, foraged, hunted, fished these mountains that we call home, and kept the old ways. When I was growing up, it wasn't a matter of, Mommy, I want to learn this. It was, you must come here and help me, and you must learn how to do this because this is how we live. A lot of people probably would have carried away from it because it wasn't a choice that was made. It was this is the way we do things. And I did for a time, but slowly in my early 20s, from 21 to about 23, I came to realize just how valuable these skills and old ways really are.
And fewer and fewer people. I mean, we have just about run out of people that know how to do these kinds of things. And it's scary because I know for myself, I don't think about where my food comes from. You know, we live in such a convenient world, and you go to Food City or you go to the grocery store and you get your food, and you don't have to think about where it comes from. You know, I know my grandparents had farm, my great-grandparents had a farm, and I know vaguely, I've heard the stories and I've seen my grandmother milking and things like that. Nothing to the extent of what you all are able to do. When I found your account and I started going through your stuff, I thought this would be everything because you would never have to worry about that, right? Because you can take care of yourself. there are so many of us who depend on this infrastructure now who probably couldn't survive without it.
Well, one thing I will say is back in, was it 1989-ish, when the Cold Swap was happening here, if it had not been for my grandparents and parents and all of their siblings who were living at that time having this knowledge, I don't know that we would have come through it and fared as well as what we did, because the miners were off work something like 18 months. We quite literally had only what we grew and preserved ourselves and what Daddy hunted and fished and what we foraged. There was no going to the grocery store for us during that time, because all of the little bit of savings was had and a little bit of money that Dad earned by doing things like making swings and other woodworking projects, that all had to go to the necessities like electricity and making the car payment, which luckily I think we only had one at the time. But if we hadn't had the ability to do those things, we would have been truly in trouble. And a lot of families really were, because they had gotten away from farming and had focused more on that money from coal and lost those old ways. And it doesn't take very long to do that.
And but understanding and knowing this and passing this down, I just think it's wonderful that your family is continuing generation after generation to reinforce this knowledge and to reinforce these skills, because they're so important. I was talking about dog days earlier, and I think a lot of people write off this cause effect relationship between the weather or the signs or things like that and farming and gardening and planting. And what do you have to say about that? Does your family plant by the signs? Does your family believe in that relationship between the signs or some of the lore that we're going to talk about and its effect?
Oh, yes. Planting by the signs is absolutely a thing. The one thing that we don't do is use the Farmer's Almanac. Instead, we go outside, use our eyeballs, and look at the sky and know where the moon is and what constellation it is. Because sometimes Farmer's Almanac will get ahead of itself in its math formula, and it will say it's in the arms when it's actually still in the neck, or maybe it's gone on to the breast. So that's the one variance that I would say we have from what most people do who do practice planting by the. We watch that and several other things in the sky to tell us not only when to plant, but what the weather will be, and watching nature to know signs of what the weather will be long term.
And this is something that dates back 2,000 years, because even the Bible
Oh, yeah.
talks about, the skies and the color of the skies, because it was so important for sailors, for fishermen to understand the weather, because it could be a matter of life and death, going out on the water.
And all of the biblical feasts, were moon based. So it's not witchcraft or just something exclusive to mountains here in the United States. It's not the Appalachian way. This is the way that it was for thousands of years, and it just happens to have been so well preserved in this area.
How do you explain to people that don't understand how that works? How do you explain why, if the signs are in the breast, you have to do certain things in the garden, or if the signs are in the legs, and people don't just do this with gardening, they do this with dental work. They plan around weaning their children. They plan around the signs. How do you explain to people who say, I don't get how that works?
It's hard to explain to them, but I use the stories that like my grandfather told us and my grandmother told us when we were growing up. Storytelling is such a part of the Appalachian culture, and this was no different. They didn't know why. They just knew this was how it worked, and they had observed it for 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
It had been passed down, and they believed it. So they would just make up stories and teach us, like, for instance, that the breast of the month is good for planting because that's when Earth is able to nurse seed or the seedling.
Mm.
And so then the Earth would nurse it with its nourishment, and that's why it would grow so well. And, the head of the month you don't do. The head of the month is as bald as an old man. And there was a big story about that, about how the man of signs went too close to the sun. It was very, very familiar to Icarus. the story of Icarus, that his head got singed when he went too close to the sun looking for the moon during the time when it was the new moon and you couldn't see it. There were just all these different stories that were told, but there are 6 planting signs and 6 signs that you don't plant in. And we do everything from not having, for instance, dental work done when it's in the head of them, or, planting, being sure to plant in the breast or in the reins or secrets of them. Those are the 3 most fertile. And fermentation is in the head of the month, and that's about the only thing you can really do then. It's one of those things that is drilled into us and you just remember it. So when I'm explaining it to other people, I just tell them the story and they either believe it or they don't. And sometimes I will say to them, try it my way. Once you find that it does not ring true, then you don't ever have to do it again. And most of the time they'll do one thing and pretty quickly they're back like, oh my gosh, I weaned my baby when it was in the thighs and it only took 24 hours. They didn't cry at all. It was so easy. My milk dried up. I didn't have any trouble at all.
I mean, even if you can't pin down the exact relationship, why, it's a matter of patterns. Over time, thousands of years, people have observed, like you said, I'm a qualitative researcher, so this is how I break it down. People have observed and they've observed patterns and they see that these patterns are pretty well set. And so they know that it worked.
That is exactly it.
Yeah.
They have watched it for just like me. I'm 41. For my entire life, I have watched this bring success from weaning to castrating to planting, cutting your hair in the right sign so it'll grow, or mowing your lawn in the right sign so that it doesn't grow as fast. There are so many things that are done, and almost anything you can think of can be done by the signs. But we don't worship the signs. We're simply following the observation.
Right.
But the same goes with dog days. You talked about the star Sirius, which is in dog. They probably, this was believed in ancient Egypt. Isn't Sirius, when it rose, is when they knew the Nile would flood.
I think I did read that. It had something to do with flooding. Yes.
It brought the flooding of the Nile is what brought the nourishment to the soil. So this has been observed since ancient time, really probably since before written history. So that's what carried over into other cultures and then somehow made it to Appalachia, rural Appalachia, where we're not remote anymore. It's much easier to access us now.
Right.
For such a long time, our culture was this bubble that was almost impenetrable because it was not an easily accessible place, especially into the far reaches of hollers. And so you had families who maybe only a few times a year were coming down from the mountain and out from the depths of these hollows. Then they would share information when they were coming into town to, as my grandmother would say, trade. And all of these observations together are what formed what we know here, I believe, of dog days, which is, July 3rd, first day of dog days. If it rains on July 3rd, you will have 40 days of rain, mostly. You might have a day here and there that it doesn't, but mostly every day will rain. If it sets in dry, you will mostly have dry days with the exception of maybe a shower here and there, but not enough to speak of for those entire 40 days. A wet dog days is catastrophic. A dry dog days will make you worry that you will be well fed.
Is there any significance to the 40 days?
Well, dog days is about 40 days going from July 3rd, August 11th. So that's the significance. Also, you think back to Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness. You think to the flood of Noah, 40 days and 40 nights. There's a lot of things throughout history that are 40 days. Our crowding takes 40 days. It's a 40-day pattern, and most of that does date back to biblical times. It's the cycle.
Yeah, it's interesting.
There's no way this just happened. This was an intelligent designer with a purposeful creation. And all of these things point to that. So a wet dog days is catastrophic for a few reasons. One, all that rain will oversaturate your soil. It'll wash nutrients out of it. Your plants will either have root rot or perform very poorly. It also brings in fungal disease, which often takes your plants altogether and you have no harvest. You can't make hay in the rain and mold. It really takes away those 40 days when you would mostly be doing the harvesting, canning, putting up hay for winter. and all of those preparations that are going to carry you through the time when you do not have the ability to grow or produce more.
Now, you also sent me a list of lore associated with dog days. First one, you've got on the top of it, no swimming in natural bodies of water, you'll drown. A couple of people messaged me after that post I made yesterday, and they said the same thing, that they had heard you don't swim during dog days, which I'm sure a lot of people ignore because dog days is so hot.
So here's my thought on this. I believe that you're no more likely to be out during dog days than you are at any other time of year. However, I think our elders believe that because that's the time when you're more likely to be swimming. More people are doing it. Therefore, there are more drowning. Pertaining to dog days, it pertains to the fact that these are the hottest days of summer. More people are out swimming in those lakes and rivers.
Mm-hmm.
You can't go barefoot in the morning or you'll get dew poisoning. They also said you would get ground itch if you went barefoot after rain or of the morning when the dew was still on the grass, that you would get ground itch, and ground itch turns into gangrene, and then you would lose your foot or your leg.
Oh, my. So explain for people who don't know what dew poisoning is.
Just allegedly something that's in the dew that's akin to getting a snake bite. It just rots your limb.
Oh.
The same as ground itch. Funny story, my mom's grandmother actually had one leg. She had to have an amputation on one side, which was due to blood clot that was related to diabetes. All of my mom's young childhood, they told her that she had went barefoot during dog days.
Oh, no.
Fully believed that her grandmother had gotten ground itch and had lost her leg. She was completely convinced. There was a lot of things that are said to you as a child in Appalachia. I don't know about other places, that are not explained.
Mm-hmm.
It is just, this is how it is. And that was two of the things that's just how it was. You didn't go barefoot in the morning before the dew was dry or after the rain.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah. Another one, snakes are blind and more likely to bite. They're also meaner and faster during dog days. I don't know about blind. However, I can tell you that the only time that I've ever had snakes that normally wouldn't have struck at you like garden snake or black snake actually strike at me was during dog days. Some people say it pertains to their molting time, that's the reason, when their scales are coming off of their eyes and they can't see. Honestly, can't say that I've ever seen a molting snake during dog days. But I've seen plenty of snake skins around lately. Injuries don't heal. They get infected. And sicknesses linger until the dog days are over. I'm 41. I have found that one to be true, and I believe that it pertains to the humidity. Because, it's so, especially right now, it's so humid, you don't even need to drink water. You can go outside and just take a breath and keep your hands.
Yeah, very uncomfortable.
So, for that reason, you also don't test animals or do any slaughtering. Castrations won't heal. You'll lose the animal. And then the slaughtering will lead to poisoned meat, which I think pertains to the bugs and the heat and not being able to adequately and quickly cool it.
So do you all follow that on your farm?
Oh, yeah. We don't process anything at all during dog days. Absolutely not. Hog killing time, for instance, is in November.
Mm-hmm.
And really you should do your other animals at cold times of year as well. Traditionally, that's when it was always done. Mm-hmm. Only, I think, as people have worked other jobs and haven't had the time all of the year to get ready to do it in the winter, has it become a thing where people are slaughtering in the summer.
Yeah.
So I have seen people on Instagram do it, and I always wonder why, with as many flies and bugs and the heat, why you would ever do it in the summer, but they do nonetheless. And so you wouldn't do that during dog. Storms are worse, and lightning is more likely to strike you or your home during dog days. Storms is worse because it's hotter. We know that. Back in the early days, I'm sure they didn't understand the weather and how storms formed and what caused their storms, but we know that that's why. My dad actually was struck by lightning during dog days. He wasn't.
Oh my goodness!
We were camping, and it came a terrible thunderstorm, and he had gone out to close something, maybe roll up a window in a vehicle. And when he took hold of the camper door to come back in, lightning struck the camper and shot out his elbow, which had previously had terrible arthritis in it, and it has never bothered him.
So he wasn't like permanently injured from that or anything?
No, it knocked him down kind of knocked him loopy, but he was okay. Basically, dogs and other animals are more likely to go mad and be rabid, probably because, this is just my opinion, more animals, for instance, raccoons, are having to come from the forest into humanized areas to look for water because it's so hot. And so there's more likely to be encounters among your dogs and wild animals during this time. Therefore, rabies is a risk.
That actually happened to us a couple days ago. I've never seen a raccoon around here out in the daylight. And I heard this noise. I thought it was a bird at first calling, and I thought, that doesn't sound like a bird. So I went, it was a baby raccoon hanging onto a tree in our backyard. And it looked absolutely terrified. And of course, I got all the animals inside because they were going nuts. It looked like maybe it had lost its mother, or it was, it was confused. And I thought, well, maybe if it calls long enough, it'll find her. We went back in the house and just waited a while, and then went back out about an hour later, and it was completely gone and didn't hear anything. So I'm hoping mother found it.
I feel like they come into areas where we have taken their domain more.
Yeah, I'd say a lot of this can be attributed to heat. Heat is just not good for anybody.
I don't know about you, but get me out and get me hot, and we'll probably have an argument. But the other thing that my nanny always said was that evil is more rampant days. And that's why there's more family quarrels and breakups and things like that. And that, again, just like we just said, I think it pertains to heat.
Yeah.
When it gets hotter outside, the temperatures rise as well. Pretty soon you have people arguing, and before you know it, whole families are at odds.
You've got one about eggs will all be roosters.
Oh, yes. You don't set eggs during dog days because they will all be roosters. And the roosters will all be mean. I think that pertains to belief that the heat is what determines the gender. Never researched that, but I just somehow doubt the gender is determined by the temperature. Mm-hmm. That's what the old people. The other thing they say is dog days, dry and clear, will bring a bountiful harvest year. Dog days that are wet with rain leave our bellies filled with pain, meaning we'll go hungry. I am praying for a dry dog days. We cannot afford a 2022 repeat. If you remember 2022, we had, I think it was 27 straight days of rain before we had colossal storm that flooded over in our neighbors in Letcher County, washed that county nearly completely away. We just can't have it. Yeah. So I'm praying for dry. I can turn my water hose on. I cannot turn the stove.
Right. And you said you don't trim or cut your hair or fingernails during dog days because it stunts growth. Girls don't trim or cut.
The girls. Well, and true, when you're cutting your fingernails, you could nip the quick, have an injury then. I think it's probably why that was. Mm-hmm. You get an injury, it wouldn't heal, and you might lose a finger. And they didn't have fingernail clippers. They were using knives
That's true. That's true. Got to have the context. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So, and then the hair not growing, they say not to do, we prune our tomatoes routinely, but we don't prune them during dog days. And it's because it'll stunt the growth. I think, again, that comes back. I don't think this has anything to do with hair, but I think just the idea comes again to the heat. Because I don't know if you grow tomatoes. If you're growing tomatoes, right now your tomatoes may have set fruit. Those fruit are not going to ripen for several weeks because it's too hot. Things will just sit. And it's that way with everything, not just tomatoes. Things will just sit when it's as hot as it is right now. Until those temperatures are coming back down more into the upper 70s, things are not going to ripen. And I think they thought that way with their hair as well. They saw that nothing else was growing, and they just assumed that would apply to everything.
So do you prune anything during dog days, or do you just wait on everything?
Oh, no, we mow the grass because we don't want to have to do it as often.
Yeah.
And of course, you're going to do the things that need to be done. I have pruned tomatoes and such during dog days, and I personally have found that it makes no difference. I understand why their observations led them to think, but it did. Mm-hmm. Because those tomatoes they're not going to ripen no matter what. But probably they didn't understand that.
That's a lot to think about with dog days. It's a long list.
There's plenty more, but those were kind of like the main thing. When I called Daddy and my mom was talking to them last night on the phone, they were spitting out things that you weren't supposed to do in those days. There's just so many.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the other things that I noticed when I was doing my research was that the Dictionary of American Regional English, in their interviews with people in the 60s and 70s, people use this term in a different way when they were asking questions about expressions of time and time elapse. People would use the phrase dog days. So, for example, they would say, I haven't seen him in a number of dog days.
And I've heard people say dog year, and I assume that it means
Maybe that's what that means.
it feels 7 years because, they say that a dog's year is 7 years.
Yeah.
It's about the aging. Of course, we know that, but I've heard people say, well, I ain't seen in a coon's age.
Mm-hmm.
I've not seen him in a dog's year or in a coon's age, or I've heard the dog days one. I've never completely understood why you would use that as an expression of time,
but now it makes sense when you just explain it. So this has nothing to do with the time period of July and August. This is a measure of the dog's age, and it's just an expression. I haven't seen him. It's another way of saying I haven't seen him in a long time.
Right, because if you think if one of our years is 7 of theirs, then one of our days is 7 of theirs.
Yeah.
So if I haven't seen you in 5 dog days, that's about a month and some days.
Yeah. Well, this is all really fascinating, and I'm so excited that you joined me to lend your expertise and what you know about it. And I hope that you can come back from time to time. Would you want to do that?
I'll come back anytime you'd like me to. I wouldn't call myself an expert in anything.
I think when you know a whole lot, maybe expert enough, I think you're pretty expert in your area. Thank you so much, Shallon, for being on, and here's to making it through dog days.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll make it through them dry.
Yeah. If you like the content that I'm putting out into the world through Talking Appalachian, I hope you'll join me over on our Facebook community, Instagram community, and subscribe on YouTube. You can also become a paid subscriber on our Patreon page, where you can support the podcast and receive early access to episodes, bonus content, deep discounts on merchandise once that becomes available.